Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Photography and Democracy Conference lecture. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. Lecture number 3. Thy Phu is talking to us today. T is Distinguished Professor of Race, Diaspora and Visual Justice at the University of Toronto. She's the author of 2 fantastic books, Picturing Model Citizens, Civility in Asian American Visual Culture, and Warring Visions, Photography and Vietnam. She's also co-editor of 3 volumes, including Feeling Photography, Refugee States, and Cold War Camera. I've been lucky enough to read extracts from a further volume on visual citizenship and settler colonialism, which I think will be out next year. And unless I'm wrong, this lecture relates to material from that fascinating volume. Thank you, T, for joining us. I'm really excited to hear what you've got to share. We will have the lecture, and as mentioned, then we'll go to a Q&A. All right, enough from me. Happy to hand over to you, T.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thanks to the organizers of this event and to all of you for coming. I look forward to our discussion. If you can just thumbs up if you can hear me and can see the slides.
I can hear you and see the slides.
Okay, fantastic. I'll just get started. In 2001, photographer Fazal Shaikh captured a striking portrait of Zainab Azir Wadere, a Somali refugee in the Netherlands. Wadere poses against the dark backdrop, her eyes closed. Though her face seems affectless, the tight set of her lips hints at disapproval. This portrait, part of Sheikh's ongoing series about forced displacement, challenges conventional representations of vulnerability, highlighting a moment of subtle defiance. When this image was reproduced in Human Archipelago, a photo book collaboration with public intellectual Teja Cole, it was placed alongside Cole's assertion that citizenship has nothing to do with nationality, and the reality of citizenship is independent of any documents issued or withheld by the state. Facing the camera while denying access to her gaze, Wadere gestures towards this other mode of citizenship. When viewed alongside Cole's avowal, her mutinous gesture resonates with critic Ariella Azulai's call to enact a civil contract of photography as a means of liberating sovereignty from the state. The portrait highlights the urgent need to rethink citizenship and sovereignty, particularly for refugees whose status is often determined by the state, which exerts the power to adjudicate claims to belonging. This talk addresses the challenge of reclaiming citizenship from state sovereignty by exploring how photography might constitute acts of refugee citizenship. Asserting that citizenship is more than a legal status, critics have called for reconsideration of this concept to take account of aesthetic expression and quotidian practices. This call takes seriously the significance of acts of citizenship, so not just the legal definition of citizenship, but an enactment of it, and as such dovetails with Azulai's contemporaneous invocation of a civil contract of photography. Critical commonplaces about refugees assume that they embark on a linear journey from a state of precarity to settlement, from statelessness to belonging in a new nation state. In short, from refugee to citizen. However, this assumption takes for granted the nation state's centrality in determining borders and in adjudicating asylum claims. This dominant view seldom acknowledges the dangers of the journey, nor does it fully account for the scale and frequency of obstacles, not to mention the detentions, deferrals, and deportations that often arrest refugees. For all who make it to the supposed end, there are many more who are lost, who are disappeared along the way, or for whom the temporary state of statelessness is an ongoing condition. The camp, meant to be a provisional shelter, settles its unwieldy moorings into uncomfortable permanency. Nor for that matter does this dominant view recognize the attachments that refugees hold to the nations they have lost. As critics have observed of diasporic communities such as Tibetans in Canada and further abroad, the conferral of citizenship does not necessarily mean giving up one's status as refugee. Instead, these communities hold fast to their refugee status as a means of protest against the very states that forcibly displace them. A further problem with viewing national citizenship as the culmination of forced migration is that the very act of settlement in a settler state implicates refugees in ongoing processes of Indigenous dispossession and displacement. Positing that citizenship aligns solely with the state forecloses the possibility of solidarity with Indigenous assertion of sovereignty. Harsha Walia and other migrant justice activists laid the groundwork for these provocations, protesting what she calls border imperialism, a concept that interrogates power inequities undergirding the operationalization of borders in ways that govern, discipline, and oppress people who seek to move across colonial spaces. To assume that the nation state has exclusive authority to confer citizenship is to miss the bigger picture in which photography enacts the potential of refugee citizenship. Nearly 2 decades ago, Azulai conjured forth this bigger picture in the civil contract of photography, a concept that she then elaborated in 2 subsequent books, The Civil Imagination and Potential History Unlearning Imperialism. To enter the civil contract of photography is to shift from considering an image in its singularity, or what she calls a photographed event, and instead entails focusing on the event of photography, the dynamic encounter that occurs before, during, and in the extended afterlife that follows the creation of an image. This is an encounter whose significance resonates despite the absence of an image, as is the case when images have been lost, stolen, or destroyed, or when conditions prevent their creation in the first place. To attend to the meanings of photography through a shift from image or photographer or spectator to the dynamics of encounter between all three is to recalibrate power relations. When I first engaged with Azulai's work in my first book, I was intrigued by the civil contract's radical potential, but troubled by the state's entrenched role in producing and reproducing identity images or ID images. These images, captured by agents of what citizenship studies scholars call an humanitarian regime, serve to distribute aid and bolster state authority. ID images often validate refugee testimony and promote humanitarian exceptionalism, positing the nation state as a rescuer while obscuring its role in producing refugees. Though responses to Azulai's work have been lively, they often overlook a key detail in her framework: the central role of the refugee in the photographic encounter. In the civil imagination, Azulai describes an image of Palestinian men being led along the streets of an occupied city. This image, she argues, does not simply depict refugees or citizens, but rather represent subjects within a political context that shapes their legal and political status. By focusing on the event of photography, Azulai uncovers how these categories, refugee, citizen, non-citizen, are not fixed, but rather contested and politically produced. Azulai's interpretation assumes the undesirability of refugee status, given her focus on the violence underlying the establishment of the State of Israel and the displacement of Palestinians. Activating the civil imagination in this case means seeing these men in the photograph as Palestinians, not as refugees, and recognizing the settler colonial state's role in producing refugees. It also involves rejecting these processes and advocating for the unlearning of imperialism. However, this framework does not easily apply to contexts where subjects are refugees in their encounter with photography. If recognizing subjects as people instead of as refugees is an act of political imagination, what framework can assert the political act of being a refugee? To answer this, we must shift from examining the processes that create refugees to focusing on the experience of subjects whose interaction with photography is integrally tied to their refugee status. Few critics offer more poignant insight into refugee-centered positionality in photographic encounters than Cambodian-Canadian writer Y Dang Trong. In her posthumously published memoir, Landbridge, Life in Fragments, Trong reflects on a photograph of a family taken in 1980 when they were among the last 60,000 Southeast Asian refugees accepted into Canada. Greeted by Prime Minister Trudeau, this moment was captured by a parliamentary photographer and later published as part of Human Interest Stories. that was reproduced in the national press in Canada. For decades, the image has symbolized Canada's humanitarianism, despite the Trong family's requests for its removal from the public sphere. The image of their refugee status serves as a tool of national self-promotion, which was then mirrored by Justin Trudeau's similar gesture toward Syrian refugees in 2017, in widely photographed moment where he welcomed the first group of Syrian refugees after, in the wake of a welcoming policy. While this aligns with the civil imagination's aim to expose state cruelty, the story is more complex. As I discussed in my other works, refugee ID images and press photos, such as the one of the Trong family, move between public and private spheres. Over the years, the Trong family has reclaimed the photo, placing it in their personal albums to highlight their resilience, even as it reflects Canada's image as a humanitarian leader. These photographs not only serve the state's purpose, but also enable the refugees to assert their own status. State-issued ID photos and press photos may enforce border control or even the nation's own stories about its beneficence, but they give refugees also a chance to be seen. Even if such representations are shaped by state power or asserted, they also reflect the aspirations of refugees. This dynamic is starkly evident in the case of Abdikhani Ibrahim Ali, who fled Somalia after his father was murdered. 3 years after Ali was granted permanent residency, the Canadian Border Services Agency, or CBSA, maintained that he was not who he claimed, but rather a Kenyan named Abdikhani Farah Yare, who had entered Canada on a student permit. The evidence supplied to counter Ali's refugee story was a set of photographs shown here in a news story about this scandal that officials had on file of the two men, Yari and Ali. The CBSA maintained that the resemblance between Abdikhani Yare and Abdikhani Ali was so close that they could only conclude the two men were one and the same. Ali's lawyer asserted that the case hinged on the failure of the CBSA to distinguish between two different men, a misrecognition predicated on anti-Black racism. The precarious circumstances that led to Ali's arrival in Canada meant that he lacked a single piece of identification to refute the CBSA's allegations by proving he was whom he claimed to be. Because Ali lacked an ID photo, an image of the refugee as refugee, the supposed evidence of the other pictures prompted the CBSA to revoke his refugee status. Ali's plight attests to the importance of refugee ID photos as not just instrumental to the state, but also pivotal for refugees who depend on their evidentiary value in supporting their claims to refugeeness. The scrutiny Ali experienced has intensified to such an extent that refugee advocates and support workers accuse the CBSA of using AI facial recognition technology for refugee surveillance. Despite ongoing denial from government agencies that AI tools are employed for these purposes, or that these tools are employed for these purposes, the experiences of two Black women, Asha Ali Bar and Aliyah Musa Hosh, suggests otherwise. After the two women applied for driver's licenses, the Ontario Ministry of Transportation flagged them when their photographs appeared to match other women in their database. The ministry passed this information along to the CBSA, which revoked the women's refugee status, despite the unreliability of facial recognition technology in identifying Black and also Asian faces. The obstacles that Black refugees have encountered in seeking and retaining refugee status in Canada suggest that misrecognition is the norm rather than the exception in the digital era, for all that the facial recognition surveillance technologies are meant to resolve the identificatory uncertainties that have long haunted the state. By highlighting biases in machine learning that have resulted in a denial of refugee claims, I do not suggest that we need to advocate for the improvement of surveillance tools as a means of addressing inequities in the nation state's visual regime. Such an approach would no doubt further fortify the very principles of state sovereignty that caused harm in the first place. The fault lies in a viewing position already predisposed to see in racial terms, whose very purpose is to unmake refugees, a function that operates on a continuum with the refugee-making process that Azulai exposes in her account of the civil imagination. The point is not that the state needs to create a perfect fraud-proof ID photo or to ensure that facial recognition technologies are flawless. A solution cannot be found by doubling down on the problem. I draw attention to the injustices that Ali, Bar, and Hosh experienced due to the state's racialized misrecognition, to caution against making quick judgments based on racist ways of seeing encoded in the flawed machine learning algorithms for visual analysis. The dearth of documentation renders racialized refugees especially vulnerable. I draw attention to these cases, moreover, to re-emphasize that while they illuminate the indisputable power of images in opening doors to refuge and in closing them, it is important to take seriously a crucial subtext that I see emerging within these stories: the desire of refugees for self-representation, indeed the need for self-representation, which can be understood as a desire for the right to photography as a means of claiming their right to life and to dignity. Refugees assert their rights to photography and as photographed subjects in manifold ways, using visual regimes of surveillance and nation-making to serve purposes that sometimes go well beyond the state's intentions. While these images, such as refugee ID photos, primarily function to serve the nation state, they should not be dismissed just because they do so. As Ali's harrowing experience reveals, such images are crucial in contesting other forms of visual surveillance designed to enforce border imperialism. This assertion of autonomy is not limited to instrumental images such as ID photos, but extends to other photographic forms, like the portrait of Zainab Azir Waderi that I showed earlier. Part of a larger series by Fazil Sheikh, as I mentioned earlier, this portrait exemplifies his ongoing work since the 1990s, which centers refugees navigating displacement in Amsterdam. Sheikh's project resonates with his own family's migration experience during the partition of India and Pakistan, followed by resettlement in the United States. Through his carefully crafted portrait, Sheikh underscores the dignity, resilience, and emotional connection refugees maintain with families and communities they have lost. In one series, Waderi's eyes alternate between closing and opening. When viewed together, the portraits convey a sense of movement, though the sequence of this movement cannot be determined. Perhaps Waderi blinks as a gesture of shielding against an intrusive gaze, so that in this photographic encounter, the refugee asserts the terms in which she will look and be looked at. Are her eyes opening or are they closing? Though we cannot tell, the portraits convey the passing of time, which takes us from one ambiguous gesture to the next one, and serves both as a reminder that photography is a lens-based art and an oblique recognition of the very nature of photography. No matter how insignificant the gesture may seem, it may be as glancing or as imperceptible as a blank. Waderi's portraits attest to the refugee's capacity to shape or to influence the terms in which images emerge, and to render explicit the collaborative terms of a photographic encounter. Even when the world more readily recollects the artist's name and rarely records the name of his subject, all photography is, as the Collab project has pointed out, fundamentally the result of a collaboration. The critic Eduardo Cadava has observed that Sheikh's work, which reflects on migrancy in relationship to the medium, is, as he puts it, an allegory about photography. They act to query, even challenge norms of representation. These are photographic portraits and inspire not only meditation on the act of photography, but also the extent to which photographic encounters carve open space for refugees to enact and assert their autonomy. To view the portraits in this way is to attend to Waderi's way of seeing, which necessitates centering her, the refugee, as a photographic subject, and not just someone who has been photographed. The work of Vietnamese American artist Binh Dinh also engages critically with the history of photography in projects that draw inspiration from his lived experience as a racialized refugee who fled Vietnam with his parents in the late 1970s. In particular, his work grapples with the legacies of the global Cold War, which flat hot in Southeast Asia, engulfing his own homeland and neighboring countries such as Cambodia as proxy battlegrounds that precipitated the so-called Indo-Chinese refugee crisis of the 1980s. In projects such as Immortality, The Remnants of Vietnam, and American War, 1 Week's Dead, The Iridescence of Life, in the eclipse of Angkor, and more, Binh Dinh meditates on the ruins of war and the monumental practices of memorialization through experiments with daguerreotypes and chlorophyll printing. As an example, his work with daguerreotype draws on the mirrored surface of the image to prompt self-reflection on the spectator's relationship with the somber pictures inscribed on the surface. In this manner, Dinh compels viewers to contemplate their position not as distant world spectators far removed from events that unfolded a lifetime ago and thousands of miles away. Instead, he invites viewers, especially those based in the US, which authorized the dropping of millions of bombs in Southeast Asia, to acknowledge their relative proximities in relationship to the violence that consumed supposedly far-flung places in Vietnam and Cambodia, and to consider their own connection and complicity to this refugee-producing violence. Dinh's work with chlorophyll printing, which entails embedding images on the surfaces of leaves through photosynthesis, also challenges viewers to reassess photography's histories, an issue I examine shortly. Before doing so, it's important to note that both daguerreotype and chlorophyll printing are such uncommon photographic processes as to be all but obsolete. Resurrecting these processes when critics have long pronounced the end of photography seems odd, if not contrary. However, it is hardly coincidental that Dinh reverts to outmoded photographic processes at the cusp of the digital turn. He was working around 2002 to 2004 on these specific projects. Nor is it accidental that he should work with these outmoded processes well after digital technologies have decisively transformed photographic practices. Instead, the persistent turn to ostensible anachronism suggests a deliberate revisioning of photography's multifaceted history as a way of reorienting perspectives on war, memory, and forced migration. In his series, Immortality, The Remnants of Vietnam and the American War, Dinh prints images of soldiers, war victims, and iconic scenes from the prolonged conflict onto leaves. Among these images are reproductions of what look to be press photos of refugees, whose vulnerability is underscored by the fine, frail veins of the exposed leaves on which their image is printed. Though they appear dry and brittle, the leaves bear the physical imprint of human history, one whose image is as terrible as it is beautiful, a process that viewers are enjoying to witness. Nowhere is the influence of Dinh's lived experience of refugeeness more palpable than in Pulau Bidang, a 2004 project he created after a trip 2 years earlier in 2002 to the refugee camp where he had stayed with his family in the early 1980s before they resettled in the US. The photographs from the Pulau Bidang series consist of the faintly imperceptible imprints of refugee presence on the island, a tombstone all but buried beneath jungle foliage, the ruined hull of a boat improbably encased in trunks of tropical trees, whose palm leaves cast long shadows across weather-beaten boards, the base of a pier dotting a path descending into the depths of a deceptively calm sea, a cross still propped up, pointing to prayers for what might have been, despite the devastation of generations who lost loved ones along the journey, or who experienced the indignities and injustices of involuntary repatriation. Dinh's camera documents what remains of the camp and the faint traces of the lives and hopes of the refugees who passed through the space. This documentary approach is evident in the reproduction of refugee ID photos of the family, which are also included in the series. A further reminder that, as noted earlier, this instrumental image asserts a meaning for refugees that cannot be reduced to the imperatives of state surveillance, even though it undeniably dovetails with these imperatives. Significantly, what might be described as a documentary mode of photography encompasses these different stylistic approaches. In images of the camp ruins, we see Dunn's concern detailing the remnants of refuge and refugeeness, a space and experience that have not been and will not likely be memorialized. By including this refugee ID photo of himself as a child alongside his mother and brother in the series, Dunn concedes the potency of the state to define refugeeness, and yet shifts the terms on which refugeeness is to be seen. Through the act of rephotographing the ID image, Dunn reorients perspectives to focus on how refugees see and remind us of their right to represent themselves as subjects of photography. Dunn further stretches the documentary mode through another set of images in the series, in which found documents, tattered papers that he presumably unearthed during his 2002 visit, appear as ghostly prints in the shape of a large tropical leaf. In this part of the series, Dunn draws on his signature technique of chlorophyll printing. Using the natural pigment in plants, this chlorophyll technique entails placement of a photographic negative on a leaf and exposing it to sunlight for an extended period. The areas of the leaf exposed to light will bleach, whereas the areas shaded by the negative retain their chlorophyll, creating an image. As in his intrinsically ephemeral practice or process, the images that appear through chlorophyll printing are subject to processes of decay, in contrast to the durability offered by photographs produced through the development of film, which relies on chemicals to fix and stabilize images. That is, the fragility and temporality of chlorophyll prints contrasts markedly with the permanence associated with traditional photographic prints, prompting reflection on the passage of time, the transience of life, and the inevitability of death. By employing this process to print documents already faded to illegibility, Dunn transmutes a sheaf of paper to a leaf, reversing the manufactured process whereby nature supplies the materials for culture. That is, he returns the paper to its origins in a manner that prompts reflection on the fate of the unknown writers of the palimpsestic document's unreadable message, who, having likely already passed, would have returned to Earth. The ephemeral nature of the leaf gives delicate form to the fragile existence of refugees, who often live in precarious conditions, face uncertain futures, and whose memories are acutely vulnerable to forgetting. By printing their images in this organic medium, Dunn comments on the nature of refugee struggles despite the forces that would erase them from existence. By experimenting with a process that is at its core fleeting, Dunn challenges traditional notions of photographic permanence and invites contemplation on the fragile nature of memory. In his photographs, Dunn uncovers the barely perceptible traces of refugee presence while also registering the inexorable disappearance of these traces. This is a presence that asserts no allegiance to national forms of citizenship, but instead foregrounds the refugee condition. In their work, Sheikh and Dunn center refugees in photography by interrogating its very history as a social practice thoroughly implicated in the making and unmaking of refugee subjectivity. Though their work takes different forms that encompass portraiture and chlorophyll printing, in addition to more conventional documentary representation, Sheikh and Dunn's projects offer a glimpse into the creative potential of photographic acts of refugee citizenship. In shedding light on collaboration, ephemerality, and durability, these two photographers offer a different way of perceiving citizenship beyond the myopic perspective of the nation state. So far I've been examining refugee citizenship through various photographic practices, many of which intentionally use archaic methods to highlight their historical significance. I conclude by briefly speculating on the future of photography in an era when its end, predicted since the 1990s, seems imminent, driven by AI-generated imaging. While AI-generated images appear photographic, they are constructed from biased data sets, raising concerns about the erosion of truth in photography. In 2021, after Amnesty International uploaded AI-generated images of migrant protesters at a rally in Colombia onto its social media channels, the human rights organization came under fire for the risk this practice posed to undermining the reality of ongoing resistance to a brutal and repressive state. Human rights agencies justified their actions by asserting that images remain crucial in eliciting sympathy from the public and by asserting their wish to protect refugees from scrutiny and surveillance, which makes organizations reluctant to use photographs of them. Given that one justification, you need images in order to elicit kind of a human connection, and yet if you use these images, you're exposing the subjects in the images to harm. Images are harmful, and yet they remain needed. Generative AI appears to offer an efficacious resolution to the predicament. However, critics charge that the decision to use this technology unravels the very premise of witnessing, which relies on the evidential qualities of an image anchored to an indexical reference. After all, such images are made through the virtual reassemblage of visual information into a phantasmatic projection. Critics contend that one cannot witness an event or an experience that did not take place. At a time when disinformation proliferates, the threat of deception has intensified and the potential for political and social harm magnified. The issue is compounded by the distortions prevalent in a public repository of refugee images. When I tested DALL-E, a well-known image generator, I encountered the problem firsthand. After giving a generic prompt to create an image of a refugee, DALL-E repeatedly generated variations of the same image, what I take to be, in its view, an emblematic refugee, which was a Black Muslim identifiable by distinctive garments and head covering. While the consistency of this outcome may stem from my limited understanding of natural language prompts, it's clear that DALL-E produced this particular image despite my not specifying a particular refugee group. The irony is evident, for as Black Muslims, a group whose asylum claims, as I have shown, are often scrutinized and contested based on visual grounds, and yet they remain projected as the exemplary refugees. This highlights why we should not rely on technical solutions to radically rethink citizenship, as these are often built on flawed premises and biased ways of seeing. Yet despite these limitations, the desire for visualization persists and deepens, particularly with generative AI. One striking example of this desire is the project Exhibit AI, the refugee account, where the Australia-based law firm Morris Blackburn commissioned 134 AI-generated images based on eyewitness accounts from asylum seekers detained on Nauru and Manus Islands as part of a class action lawsuit. When the lawsuit failed, the firm launched a project to ensure the voices of refugees, which it had thoroughly documented, could be preserved, seen, and heard. One image created from the testimony of a witness listed as LW05 depicts a mouth stitched closed with black thread with the caption, "Until I arrived and went to school in Australia, I did not know that it was not normal for a teenager to be exposed to people regularly attempting suicide or people sewing their mouths shut." This was part of the daily life, everyday daily life in Nauru. The project used generative AI to visualize these experiences, as cameras were prohibited in the detention centers. Images could only be produced clandestinely or through AI. Despite the organizers' justifications, critics highlight the risk of AI-generated images in undermining the veracity of the testimony, echoing concerns raised in response to the Amnesty International case. Notably, the British Press Photographers Association succinctly rejects AI-generated images, calling them fiction, and asserting that fictional images negate testimonial truths. This view, though understandable, overlooks the perspective of refugees, which this talk has tried to foreground. Exhibit AI, the refugee account, calls on us to center refugees' perspectives and take seriously their desire to be seen, their yearning for photography, and their claim to the right to be photographed. It does so without misrepresenting the images in the exhibit as photographs. One survivor, who calls herself Erina, expressed this hope. "If this experience, quote, affected me this much, we needed to have those images to go with this story." Erina's reflection underscores her deep desire for images. Taking this desire seriously does not mean embracing AI-generated images as substitutes for photographs. Indeed, as noted, the images could not be made due to prohibitions on photography. Though I do not wish to dismiss debates on the risks of AI-generated images in undermining the credibility of photography and shattering the very premise of witnessing, the terms of these debates are fixed within narrow assumptions of what a refugee image should be, or for that matter, of conventional notions about photography, which persist despite challenges to them. Rather, it is to question the belief that the state alone defines citizenship, and at the same time to surrender assumptions about photography, especially the notion that images are free from processes of manipulation. After all, critics have traced this desire for photography to at least a century before the advent of this technology, even as far back as 1492, the start of colonialism. Significantly, the concept of the event of photography introduces the notion of the photographic to emphasize the importance of the dynamic encounter between agents in the event rather than an image alone. This concept registers the encounter even when there is no photograph to document it, even when there is an AI-generated image created to address the prohibition on photography. Ultimately, the refugee citizenship that I'm heralding here can only be conjured forth and enacted by considering ways of seeing otherwise, which entails broadening our understanding of photography and its histories. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's exactly the sort of interventions that we're really keen to hear about in this forum, challenging our assumptions about democracy and democratic states, and questioning our conceptions of photography and using the two to work in parallel with one another. Thanks very much.